Arab Gulf and CEO of Blue Laurel, and Dr. Ofir Winter, senior researcher in the INSS. The host is Dr. Gallia Lindenstrauss, a senior researcher. Now, we'll be dealing, I'm very happy to host this forum, and we'll talk about the perpendicular normalization and we'll talk about the existing normalization. And the next panel will talk about the horizontal normalization. I would like to begin with you, Aliza. The situation is not simple, but we have to do with what we have. So, despite the situation and the prolonged war, how could we advance political and interstate collaboration in the region? Well, thank you. When the war began, one of the objectives of the foreign ministry was to maintain relationship with the peace and normalization countries, and this is what we aimed for from day one. We've heard before, and I don't want to repeat, the reactions were all in all moderate. There was criticism and condemnations, but the political relations, even if it was under the radar, were maintained. Now, the Prime Minister was not invited, but the Minister of Foreign Affairs was in the UAI, and official representatives, although confidentially, did visit here in Israel and also in the Gulf and Morocco too. We actually have, what I would say, pretty war relations with Morocco when we look at the tensions and reality that this war in Gaza has brought about in Morocco and elsewhere in the region. Now, when we look at it from the present and also future perspective, the influential factors are the economic and financial ones. In September 2023, the I2U2 framework was significantly boosted, and the negotiations with India and the Emirates continued throughout that period. Even in New York, there were meetings even after the outbreak of the war. We could not have made it public, but the negotiations and the attempts to promote the land route and bypassing the Arab Gulf, which is an inseparable part of the present collaboration, or maybe it's exaggerated to call it collaboration, but there are contacts to prepare for the day after, in reality will enable its advancement. So the economic aspect and looking at Israel as a strategic partner, despite the difficulties publicly and globally, is something that I think will remain. So, and also academically, the relationship with the King's University in Morocco were maintained. Delegations from civil society continued coming, even from Bahrain. It was under the radar indeed and very humble, but we cannot say that the ties have been cut. Of course, it's not the same as before October 7th, but there is an intention to preserve these ties. But the longer the war, the more pressure over Israel. And I would just like to add another aspect. We have Israel versus the international system. It's not only regional, it's also how Israel is perceived and presented in the international system. And we know that we are at one of the lowest points of Israel's public or international image, and this has implications on normalization. Now, there's another thing that I would like to add. Yes, it's Iran and the Palestinians, but there are things beyond. There's China, US, China's attempt to tighten its hold on the region through various economic projects in fields in which it has added value, AI, technology. And what was supposed to be a counterbalance to the U.S. that the Gulf states share. For example, Russia, where is the Gulf's position versus Russia, Ukraine? The normalization states, too, we should be cautious and look where we're heading, because the longer the war, the more they are looking for alternatives in the East. We have the BRICS, which became stronger in the recent 2 years, and the Gulf states are looking to this framework as an alternative. We no longer have all the eggs in the American basket. Indeed, we said that the U.S., with everything it has, we've seen it in the last visit of Trump in Saudi Arabia, is important. But the world is changing today, and I think that the relative edge that Israel has to offer in terms of collaboration is taking on an alternative twist that is less convenient for us. I talked about China, and this has an implication over the Gulf states and on how we could strengthen ties with the Gulf states. The U.S. and its isolation policy, well, where is this heading? To a certain extent, this has raised concern among the Gulf states. And there will be an impact to that. Now, it's not only Israel and the Emirates, there's an international community, and we have to ask where Israel is and how influential is this. The question is whether for the long run, the assets that Israel is proposing will not be hampered. And of course, in this multipolar system, there are other forces that want to strengthen their hold in the Gulf. Now, you talked about optimism and pessimism. 2 years into this war, all in all, our new ambassador in Bahrain has received an agreement. There's an agreement for a new ambassador in Bahrain, although they called back their ambassador. The Emirati ambassador has split his time between his homeland and Israel, but the diplomatic relations are still there. Yes, maybe not on the same level, but it's still there. And despite the pressures and despite the difficulties that Israel has versus the international system, these countries are no longer doing geostrategy, but looking into the economic benefits. And we have heard, even before October 7th, complaints about the way that Israel conducted itself from economic aspects. There were grievances, but it's yet preserved. And I think that we should continue looking forward into the near and also far future. How will changes in the international system impact normalization when Israel is an important actor here, but it's not in the opening 5 at all? Well, let's hear from you now, Tali. Aliza stressed the economic aspects, and as Tamir said, our relations in the framework of the Abraham Accords is also due to simple interests. Now, what are the benefits of the relationship between Israel and the Arab Gulf states?
זה עובד עכשיו? אוקיי. תודה רבה על ההזמנה להיות פה.
Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. Well, first of all, I think that we should be grateful for what we do have. Those who visited the Gulf, such as myself a decade ago, there were no direct flights, there were no direct phone calls. We could not have said the word Israel in a coffee in Dubai. Now, if we're looking 2 years back, we've heard we're the hub of the Emirates, Etihad and Fly Dubai, who continued flying. And this was safety. This was important for many Israelis. And just a week ago, the number of flights have been boosted to a flight a day. And that's important. So whether we have a warm or a cold peace, let's say goodbye to the dreams that we had 5 years ago, that they'll come over here and we'll hang out on the beach and tailor a new Middle East. I think that we have a very comfortable foundation to communicate with our region. And if you visited Dubai or Abu Dhabi, you can tell the world is big, and we don't feel it here in our Israeli swamp. Now, when we get there, we just feel like everyone is talking about us. Well, no, they're working on their own countries. Now, there are things that we could contribute in cyber and defense, in AgTech and wider tech and food tech and sustainability and health. But we need to preserve this added value. Now, when we do have this added value that they cannot buy anywhere else in the world, because they'd rather buy it anywhere else in the world, and I'm not talking only about the Abraham Accords states, but all the more so in other Middle Eastern countries such as Saudi Arabia. Any opportunity they'll have to purchase the same product from a state that is not the state of Israel, they'll do it, including China. And we, as Israelis, and in the Israeli industry, when we think that there's no competition, it's so much fun to sit with Israeli entrepreneurs in a meeting in the Gulf and to hear the question, who's your competition? Well, we're used to say there's no competition, but when the Chinese are in the picture, then we do have competition, and also in the price. So it's important to preserve our competitive edge. Now, I think that the place of the U.S. within the economic triangle that could be forged in order to overcome the obstacles today is important. For the UAE, it's especially so. It's reinforcing its relationship with the U.S. every day, especially re-AI, and we've seen it in Trump's visit. Also the Saudi Arabia, but they haven't yet decided whether they're with China or the U.S. That's a more complicated question. But the Gulf interest in reinforcing the economic ties with the U.S., plus the natural connection that we in Israeli industry have in many sectors with the American market, that gives us something to work with today. We, for example, organize conferences in the U.S. and in Africa with American entities, bringing Israeli companies and organizations from the Gulf in an American platform. And the people from the Gulf who come, they don't come in order to meet Israeli companies, but it doesn't stop them. They want to be familiar with the American market that the Israeli business community has ties with. So there's a lot to do with the U.S. as a convener. Once again, we have to preserve relationships with the U.S. and the American economic ecosystem, and we saw this in our entrance into CENTCOM. But I think that we could duplicate this model in the private sector. economically. That we've seen that the Emirati market and the Abraham Accords market are complementary to ours. They export things that are important to us, construction materials, merchandise from the East, and technology. Thank you. Now, to you, Ofir, when we talk about the Abraham Accords, we talk about the title, the Abrahamic connection. And I would like to tell an anecdote. I researched Turkey and Azerbaijan, and now we hear talk about Azerbaijan joining the Abraham Accords. Now, since the 90s, we have excellent relations with Azerbaijan. We've got embassies. Why do we need to expand the agreements and accords to Azerbaijan? But we now understand that there's a brand here. So I would like to talk about the Abrahamic connection and tie. What are the advantages and disadvantages? Well, we need to remember that the Abraham Accords was not only a technical peace agreement, but an attempt to create a new narrative that centers on interreligious brotherhood, tolerance, a connection of the shared tradition of between Islam and Judaism, and it's evident in the title. And Donald Trump testified that he had to waiver the original name of the accords, the Donald J. Trump Accords. And he told David Freeman, please explain, when they presented the Abraham Accords, please explain about the name. And the American ambassador, David Freeman, explained that Abraham was the shared forefather of the monotheistic religions, and he represents the unity between them. So this name was given in the U.S., but I think people in the Gulf and in Israel connected to it. There was an attempt here to generate a new narrative, perhaps model, to create something different and new and assist the acceptance of the notion that Jews and Muslims are cousins, historic neighbors rather than rivals, and they could have a reform and conciliation. And this notion has several advantages. First of all, it's created a good foundation not only for peace, but for normalization and warm peace that we've already mentioned between societies and peoples, not only between countries or governments or security institutions. This also has a certain religious allure when we're talking about traditional faith communities, Jewish or Muslim, when you need to explain the logic of the peace versus other traditional explanations against such a peace agreement. And another important advantage to the Abrahamic narrative is that it fit an existing ethos that existed before, the notion of sustainability and pluralism that has to do with internal aspects, the 9/11, the distancing of Morocco, for example, and the UAE from religious radicalization. The UAE has established a bureau in 2011, a bureau of tolerance and pluralism, and that made it easier to accept the accords. Now, what are the disadvantages of the notion? We'll mention two. The first is that there is still a contrary narrative of Islamistic and the Muslim Brotherhood who say the Jews are historic enemies, and there's a religious war of sorts here, and they did not accept this Abrahamic agreement. There was even a conspiracy theory widespread in the Arab world that said that there is an attempt to found a new religion called Ibrahimiyya. There have been articles and books written about it that aims to swallow all the religions and promote Zionistic American interests at the expense of Arab and Muslim interests. That's one disadvantage. The second disadvantage is that this Abrahamic narrative exists also within a certain reality. It's not something that is operating in empty space. We're talking about 2 years of a bloody war. It's much more difficult to talk about Jews and Muslims as cousins and historic neighbors, while the present situation is raging, and those who flourish and strengthen in these circumstances are radical Islamistic powers that describe the relationship between Jews and Muslims as a zero-sum game. And the question is asked 5 years later, what is stronger, the advantages or weaknesses? And it's yet difficult to give an answer to this. We've already mentioned it. Maybe there's a retreat for cold peace, maybe a relationship of reconciliation and normalization, and this is only a temporary hold or break. There's the move, there's what the UAE said in 2023, declaring that it's putting the Holocaust in the educational books as a manifestation of interreligious brotherhood. Now that has been halted. Maybe it will be renewed after the war. I think that the revival of this Abrahamic notion will call for mutual efforts and will also the generation of an enabling political atmosphere. And when we're talking about the day after the war, we have to think about that as well. Well, the day after the war, Aliza, I restricted you to the existing situation, but now let's run wild with our imagination. What would you do after the war, in the immediate as well as the long term? Well, what we're trying to do now is maintain maintenance so that things won't deteriorate too much. The economic, I noted, the I2U2 as infrastructure, of course. We need to do everything we can in order to rehabilitate this initiative, because there's competition, of course, if we're talking about the changes in Syria and Turkey. And what about the tension between the U.S. and India? Well, I think that we should be looking at this too, because the U.S. and India are part of the I2U2. And as I tried to say before, it's not only Iran, Palestinians, Israelis and the U.S., which is the center of gravity, but there are other entities whose relationship are not necessarily tied to Israel, but may impact. So the more competition, the more misunderstandings there are, the harder it will be. And that is what we need to do is, well, first of all, continue the efforts in order not to lose what we've obtained despite the past 2 years and the difficulties. We're talking about, well, an achievement. There are things that develop slowly, but if we're looking at the economic relationship, there was an astronomical leap between 2023 and 2024, despite the slowdown in recent months. The trend is positive. So yes, we should look at the existing frameworks of both security and economic collaborations, and shed light on what's happening at present behind closed doors. And I think that we should invest more efforts with all the difficulties vis-a-vis the great power competition, because this is happening nowadays globally, and this has an impact on our relationship with the Gulf states and Morocco as well. But we need to look at how we can walk between the drops. I mentioned China before, because China, too, is an actor that is reinforcing its presence in the Middle East, and we have to see how we can, if we can, and this very much depends on the relationship between the U.S. and China, how we could perhaps go back a little, because our relationships with China in the past was much more significant. But first and foremost, of course, is the relationship with the U.S., and Eyal mentioned this also We've seen in the media and vis-a-vis the support of the Republican Party in Israel, there are many elements that may impact normalization and the type of relationship between Israel and the normalization states. We need to continue with the diplomatic ties and inviting the civil society, the academy, and of course, beyond the defense, intelligence, military collaboration and relationship that has been going on in the past 2 years, and we need to reinforce this in order to demonstrate what are Israel's assets. Now, when you talked about Fly Dubai and the daily flights, I was reminded of the Turkish Airlines daily flights to Istanbul. Well, we should be cautious because this may not be forever. Now, I want to ask you, there are many obstacles to the advancement of the relationship. Could you tell me about that and how we could overcome them? Well, there are obstacles. I'll state the obvious. We need to bring back the hostages. We need to end the war. And then we can start talking about that internally in Israel and also with our neighbors, near and far. Now, indeed, I'm here to talk about economy, but what's an obstacle to economy are statements by Israeli ministers that talk to their base, but they're heard in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. And when I receive questions about, such as about Israel's imperialist aspirations. And the talks are not about the hunger in Gaza and the circumstances of the war, but about how our government is perceived today, and this is growing stronger. For the past year, there's an internal narrative in the UAE, and especially in Saudi Arabia, is where is our political leadership leading us? And this has, in the past 2 months since the war with Iran, has become an answer to almost anything. And this, indeed, is something that business could not endorse. And despite that, there are opportunities with international companies. We, in the past year, have been working with a structure in which the mother company is foreign and the subsidiaries are Israelis. There are obstacles because Israeli passports, surely in Saudi Arabia and also elsewhere, receive certain reactions. But we could overcome these obstacles with integrity when we work patiently with companies and entities on the high level. What we see in Bahrain and the UAE, companies that are linked to the government still work with Israeli companies. They don't want to make it public, but they do so. I think that we should make sure that any interaction between Israeli economic or business entities with these companies will be professional, so that they won't feel that, well, we're trying to exploit. If after the Abraham Accord there was this excitement, then now we feel that those who are dedicated are really willing to be part of the region. And I'll add that the Israeli companies and businesses that want to be part of the region, that they want to partner with the region, then the discourse is different. And then they don't have that feeling that we politically and economically both are trying to exploit the situation and run. Well, let's finish with you as the optimist, a big believer in civil society And what directions, looking into the future, do you propose? Well, I am optimistic, but I try not to be naive. And reality at present, when we're talking about the Abraham Accords and also about the other peace states, is not simple. And if you look at public opinion surveys, in Morocco, there used to, before the war, there was a support of 31% with normalization. Now it's 13%. In the UAE, it used to be over 41%. I don't know if what happens in Morocco is an indication of what's happening there. Regarding Saudi Arabia, according to a survey in Washington, there is a 1% support in normalization, and I think that leadership in non-democratic countries as well are attentive to the public opinion. And since October 7th, the Palestinian situation is viewed as a conflict more and more, even more than before, as an obstacle for normalization. Now, this is not only for Palestinians and due to solidarity with them, but also due to how the war is impacting the regional stability. Now, this doesn't mean that until the war ends, we will not be able to do anything. And well, let's be optimistic here. We've published an article, myself and Udi, a week ago, asking how Israel could go back to the normalization track. And I think that some of the recommendations are relevant for this as well. Some of them were mentioned by the previous speakers. For example, the need to orient normalization to the current agenda and among the countries of peace, where there is more openness towards the notion of normalization. For example, we've seen recently a huge energy transaction with Egypt at this very low period in the relationship. This is an example of how we can promote issues that are important to both sides, and Tali is more familiar with this than myself. Water, health, military, AI. Of course, we must be cautious from what will further deteriorate the relationship, such as various statements, or when an Israeli minister goes to Temple Mount and undermines the status quo, when they talk about transfer, which is a great threat to several of our neighbors. It doesn't help. These things indeed are problematic, and we need to be cautious from this populism that we'll probably hear more and more of, because this is an election year coming up. Now, third, I think that Israel should look into rehabilitating its image not only as a strong military power, which is good, but as a peace-wishing country that also has soft power abilities that it could offer its neighbors in favor of the thriving of the region. And I think that some of this effort should be directed inwards. We're opening the academic year in schools, and I think it's important to educate the Israeli public about peace as an ideal as well as a realistic option that we should aspire to. And in the Arab world, including the peace countries, there's a distinction even in these harsh times between the Israeli government and society, and between various elements in the Israeli government. They're not all taken as one, and even if there's deterioration in various governmental aspects, it doesn't necessarily enforce civil deterioration. And I can say that we in the ISS could be proud to say that we're perceived by our regional partners as a peace-seeking partner, a partner for discourse, and sometimes we try to fill in the vacuum between the governments and generate positive discourse in the region. And I think this is happening in the time of the war more than it happened in the past, and this is an example on how we can maintain relationship in difficult times. Well, you began with optimism and ended with it. We'll move on to the next panel.